Matt Lessinger here with Nolan Dalla, as always. This is our 10th intelligent conversation, and I've enjoyed every one of them, and I hope you have too. We have every intention of this being an intelligent conversation. I think it's also going to be more than usual, a relatively informal conversation. We're going to be discussing mask wearing, which is a hot topic right now. There's still plenty of people around the United States who are resistant to the idea of wearing masks. Our purpose today is not to shit on them, insult them, anything like that. I think our purpose is more to get into their mindset, to maybe, if possible, um, you know, talk to them and, see if anything we say resonates with them. It sort of reminds me of a story from when I was early teens. I still had to go to Hebrew school, as a nice Jewish boy in the Bronx. Um, and I didn't take too many of the teachings to heart, but there was one sermon that for some reason stuck with me, um, where he was telling a story about, a woman gives $100 donation to a breast cancer charity because it's an issue that means so much to her, and her mom had breast cancer, and it just means everything to her, and she's of modest means, but this $100 donation is really important to her. And then you have another person who donates $100 for all the wrong reasons. Maybe it's a man just trying to impress his girlfriend, or it's a politician trying to look like he's doing the right thing by giving to this charity. And the interesting takeaway, or the teaching that we were supposed to take away from it, is that we're supposed to view the two acts equally, that they're both equal donations and they're both going to do an equal amount of good. And even when somebody is doing it for the wrong reason, it's more important that they do the right thing first. And then maybe later on, they can learn why it was the right thing to do. And I think that applies here as well. Like, even people that are resistant to mask wearing, first and foremost, can we convince you to wear a mask, even if you don't believe it's the right thing to do for whatever reason? If we can convince you to do it, let's start with that. And then maybe eventually you might decide it was the right thing to do. Maybe you'll never decide it was the right thing to do. But that's where I'm at with this conversation, is maybe anything we say might resonate with you and get you to change your behavior, and then I feel like we've accomplished something. So one thing I was gonna ask you, another story. Sorry if I'm getting a little too reflective here. When did coronavirus hit home with us? Like, with each individual, there might be like that different moment of clarity. And I'll be honest, for me, it was never when it was in China, right? For several reasons. I mean, the media there was careful to not let slip too much information, so we never really saw firsthand the conditions there. But even so, I mean, I have plenty of Chinese coworkers, and a lot of them have families back in China. So I would hear reports from them, and they were legitimately scary. I mean, there were stories about people going about their lives, and then suddenly they couldn't breathe. It was a frightening image. And then once they started addressing the issue, you had stories about how people weren't even allowed to leave their homes. But I still felt, speaking for myself, I still felt removed from it, right? It was half a world away. And as an American, like, we had already dealt with SARS and Ebola, and we had heard these horror stories from abroad, but they never made it to us. So it's like there was always this feeling of removal, that we figured maybe, or I figured, maybe it was another situation like that, another Ebola, another SARS, that some other country will have to deal with and take care of, and hopefully will be spared. But When I saw the outbreak in Italy, that's when I knew we were fucked. I went in 24 hours from thinking that the US might avoid anything serious to realizing that our lives were absolutely going to change. And so that was my moment of clarity, was watching the outbreak in Italy, and maybe, rightly or wrongly, that's what got me on board with how serious this is. Do you have a similar moment of clarity, Nolan?
I do, and it's very superficial. And I appreciate how you opened the show with your parable that was, script spiritual in nature, but it certainly applies to everyone, regardless of if you have a faith or not. So I want to thank you for opening with that. And then, as far as my own, genesis on knowledge about a global pandemic, I would say I have a lot of mixed emotions about this, but I would say I'm not really um divorced emotionally from historical events. I've always been a intense student of history, and really almost a slave to current events. Meaning, when something happens on the other side of the world, just because it doesn't affect me does not mean that I don't feel the empathy or sympathy or pain in some cases. I think that's very important to point out, that if you are connected, not just through, say, family or certainly friends that may have, like you said, you had Chinese coworkers, Matt, that that you could see firsthand, or I guess secondhand in a sense, how it affects some of them. For me, just kind of like this citizen of the world, Nolan Dalla, looks at the world as one place. And so if someone is suffering somewhere, I almost feel like we all have an obligation to do what we can when we can, to the best of our ability. At least be aware of the problem. Okay, so I wouldn't say that I was at all. There were no borders on this for me emotionally. So I would also say that I remember watching a PBS documentary maybe 3 or 4 years ago. It's still out. It was repeated on PBS, and it was a show called The American Experience, which is an excellent usually hour and a half documentary on American history. And this sounds like something you would watch in eighth grade or something, but it is so entertaining and so interesting. And they did the entire show on the 1919 flu epidemic,
Hmm.
which, by the way, my grandmother, come to find out, her name was Stella Dalla from northern Italy. She died. So somebody I never met, but I do have a relative that died in that pandemic that killed, by some estimates, 40 or 50 million people globally. So I was intensely interested just from that perspective about, my goodness, what if that were to happen again? What if there were to be another 1918-19 flu epidemic? Now, we haven't reached those numbers in terms of death, fortunately. I mean, thank goodness on that, right? But as far as the moment that I remember saying, "Oh no, it just hit home," I mentioned earlier, I used the word superficial, and this is a very superficial comment, but it's just, hey, I'm human. And I was at Costco on maybe February 20th, 22nd, somewhere in there, like late February. And of course, this has been in the news as a warning, but I didn't see any, you didn't see anything, any closures. You didn't see anybody. Certainly there were no masks at the time. So I was at Costco, which is here on the west side of Las Vegas. And I went in, and I've been in that Costco 40 or 50 times, maybe more, 70, 80 times. I don't know how many times. And the lines are usually 2 or 3 baskets deep. You know what I mean by that? You go to the
Hmm.
counter and
Sure.
there's 3 or 4 baskets. You may wait 5 minutes to do the checkout. Well, the lines were, I mean, I lived in Eastern Europe during the Ceausescu years, and I remember bread lines,
Mhm.
meaning people lined up for bread, and the lines were around the block. Well, it wasn't quite like that, but it was the first time I ever saw lines to, aside from Christmas, things like that, that were just really, really long. And I said, and by the way, and the baskets were full of what? Toilet paper,
Toilet paper.
distilled water,
Mhm.
heaters, kind of like things that are, like dystopian in a sense. So when I saw that and I'm looking around and everybody's got full baskets full of staple goods, that's when I realized, oh, this thing's about to hit home. And that's when it did hit home. And uh, one last thing, and then I'll throw it back to you.
Mhm.
Well, I'll ask you a question actually, is how has this last, say, 8 or 9 months, how have you had to make adjustments to your life? I have my own, obviously, opinion about that, but I'd like to hear how this impacted you personally, Matt.
Well, I mean, that's honestly, that's such a broad question. I'm not even
Sure.
sure I could answer it. And most of it is the obvious. I mean, that we're staying at home and things like that. Um, I mean, I guess, I understand why you said your reason was superficial, but not so much. I mean, it's a moment, it's a visual moment where you see what's going on. I guess, and I don't have an answer to this. I mean, if when you go to like the middle of the country or places that up until maybe this week or these past couple of weeks weren't taking the virus as seriously, did they do those things too? Did they stock up on paper goods and have that run on bottled water, whatever? Or did they just assume it wasn't going to touch them? Because that's the impression I get with a lot of, I want to call middle America. I mean, I don't want to group everybody into one
Yeah.
simple umbrella, but the
I'm
people
sorry,
that
but I have to interrupt you.
largely,
I have to interrupt you for a
yeah,
second. The reason you're
yeah,
bringing
go
up
ahead.
Middle America right now is because as we speak here in mid to late November, that's where it's now hitting the hardest in the
Yes,
Dakotas, in the Midwest,
right.
particularly the upper Midwest. I think that's why you're singling out so-called Middle America. Yes.
Yes, and because the reason it's spread out so much is because people were largely just living their lives as if nothing had happened. So it almost feels to me like they never had that moment of clarity that this is serious. Like even when they see it happening in New York or California or wherever, maybe to them that's like me seeing it in China. It's like to them it's a world away. Like that, well, I'm in North
Great
Dakota.
point.
It doesn't matter what's
Yeah.
happening in New York City.
Great point. New York City might as well be China or London or something. Absolutely right.
Right.
Yeah.
And now maybe finally it's hitting home, but I haven't seen real evidence of that yet because people are still very resistant to changing their lives or wearing masks. So that's that's where we're at right now. It's like they must be seeing the rising rates of infection in their area, the same way that we are seeing it from a distance, you know, and they still have this mentality that it's not affecting them. Can we somehow, or can somebody provide that moment of clarity for them, without belittling them or insulting them? Um, Bill Maher had a very good segment last night, just a short part of it, about how we have to hate the cult but embrace the cult member, right? We need to remind them how in the past they were good people with good intentions and they somehow went off course, and we need to bring them back on course. Because to me,
Excuse me for a
go
second.
ahead.
That almost
Yeah,
sounds evangelical.
perhaps. I mean, because, but it's practical in this particular case because insulting them is not going to work. Like I'm not trying to protect their feelings. I'm not, and neither are you. I mean, deep down we have our opinions about, people that are resistant to mask wearing, resistant to science. Yelling and screaming at them is going to accomplish nothing, right? So right now, to me, it's all about solution. Yeah, it does sound a little evangelical, like let's open our arms and welcome everybody, but it's also practical because getting them to wear a mask could save my life, could save your life. Like it's not just about mask wearing saves your own life. Then we wouldn't really give a shit, right? It's like, okay, you don't want to wear a mask, you run the risk, go ahead, we don't care, right? It's because the mask wearing protects other people that we need to get them to act right. For me, that starts with embracing medical workers, right? It's not clear to me, and I'd like you to give your opinion on this as well. it's not clear to me why more politicians don't invoke the doctors and nurses of their state or their community to help them deliver the message. Like, I understand they're already overworked, the doctors and nurses. I mean, it's you know, it's not their job to have to do the politician's job also. But there's so little faith in politicians these days that it's like, we need something we can all agree on. Don't we all agree to support our local healthcare workers? Like, it doesn't matter what side of the aisle you're on, right? Doctors and nurses are overworked and dealing with this in the front lines. Sometimes, 12 to 18-hour days. Sometimes they can't go home to their families because they're afraid to spread COVID to them. Can't we universally get together behind them? So if I was a politician, every time I had to make a speech regarding a lockdown or new restrictions or whatever, I would do it from the local hospital. I would do it with doctors and nurses at my side. Is that so unrealistic to consider something like that?
Yes,
Why is that?
because Dr. Fauci is getting death threats. I
Okay.
mean, how ridiculous is that? Science is not, at least by a certain percentage of people in this country, is not respected, believed, trusted. That's the problem. And as far as I can tell, now you and I follow current events and watch the news, including a variety of news sources. So I think medical professionals, for the most part, are getting their due. In other words, are they being thanked enough? Of course not. I mean, these are, I mean, I don't need to get into that. I mean, I'm not overstating the case. These are frontline soldiers, every bit as important as, say, the people that won World War II. I mean, they're risking their lives in the trenches, doing
Absolutely.
thankless work for almost no sense of, certainly no reward other than the self-satisfaction of maybe saving the country and saving a stranger's life. I mean, how remarkable is that? So I'm completely with you in the sense that medical professionals cannot be thanked and shown enough gratitude by all of us, and particularly politicians. And even, those of you who watch us know that Matt and I are on the left side of the spectrum, but the right does try, meaning Republicans or people on the political right, do try to at least show the window dressing of embracing medical professionals. However, again, there's this entire, if it was just a small quackery subculture of crazies, that's one thing. We probably wouldn't be having this discussion. But it's something like 50% of Trump followers, or certainly red staters, have some suspicion about whether the virus is real or a conspiracy or what have you. There's all kinds of different offshoots of interpretation as to what COVID means, what the origins are or were, where it's headed, who's supposedly behind it. We could go into all this, and there's no one size fits all. But for me, I find it very difficult to break through this wall of crazy. I don't know how else to put it.
Well, yeah.
Go ahead, Matt.
No, okay. I mean, I get your point about Dr. Fauci. My counter argument would be that he is a national figure that is a lot more easily identifiable than your average healthcare worker. So, I mean, especially since we're talking about red states, right? So pick a red state, pick Nebraska as an example. To the best of my knowledge, the entire state of Nebraska has one major medical center, right?
Is that really true?
I'm sure there's hospitals. Yeah, because I was just reading about that, where it's like there's hospitals and whatever, but some subdivision of the Mayo Clinic,
Yeah.
That's in Nebraska,
Right.
that handles the worst cases, under normal circumstances, the worst health cases. People get driven there, flown there, whatever. And now with COVID, that's the epicenter of where they're taking care of it. So if you're living in Nebraska, you'd be hearing from the Nebraska frontline workers, right? I mean, you're not hearing from a national figure. Like, that's why I feel like it should hit home. I mean, don't we all know at least somebody that works in the medical field? Don't we know, even if they're not a doctor or a nurse, I mean, there's plenty of other people that work in doctors and hospitals. Don't you have somebody that works at the front desk or does records or does something, in the medical field that can attest to what's really happening there? Like, I just find it so hard to believe that somebody could live their lives without knowing a single person with some connection to the medical field in their neighborhood who could set them straight and say, no, this is really happening. Um, I mean, I agree that doctors and nurses are getting thanks, but I think if you ask them, they really couldn't give a shit about the thanks. Like, they don't need applause. They don't need empty gestures. They don't need cheering at 7 o'clock at night, everybody stopping and doing what they're doing. They just need people to wear masks and social distance so they could do their job more easily. Like, that's literally their only message to people is like, we're being overworked. If you fall sick, we're not going to be able to take care of you. There's not enough hospital beds, and we're falling sick ourselves because we're trying to take care of you. So how much of an ask is it for you to do your part? Now, coming from a politician, especially one on the other side of the aisle, or somebody that's, trying to enforce a policy you don't agree with, is one thing. When it's coming from the people that have to deal with it most directly, I just feel like it would carry a little more gravitas, a little, would it ring true to everybody? No, but would it change the behavior of some people? Yeah. I mean, that's what I'm talking about. Like, I mean, so you're concerned. Do you really think like not that they have the time to do this, but like if a group of doctors and nurses for 5 minutes assembles outside their hospital with, such and such governor or mayor or whoever, and as a whole, just tries to get their message across, are they facing that much backlash? Like, I might be naive. Maybe I thought, their word is going to be taken at face value, but you are of the opinion that people are so set in their collective mindset that they're not even going to take the word of people working the front lines.
Yeah, we've done previous shows on this, Matt, about people getting their news and information from, essentially echo chambers of,
Right.
different channels, and not all of it's consistent, and certainly a lot of it's distorted. Some of it's just outright bullshit. I mean, we know
Of
this.
course, yes.
So you're asking a question to me, as I guess a lot of my life was in public relations and marketing. This is a marketing question. You're asking how does the government or society sell the idea of staying home, wearing a mask, doing this kind of thing, and without going out in the streets and getting all upset about it. Public education. There was a time when when various campaigns were orchestrated. Again, World War I, World War II, fight, support the troops, sacrifice, even rationing was going on at the time. Most of the public was behind those things.
Right.
The war on drugs was another thing that was not successful in the sense of stopping illegal drug use. Certainly the war on drugs was a massive failure. However, the marketing campaign or the public relations campaign on, say, the so-called war on drugs was successful in the sense that if you were to ask 300 million Americans, are you aware of this, that drugs are bad for you? Probably 300 million Americans would say, yeah, we're aware of it, and we've seen the commercials. So the thing is, if so you're saying run commercials or have the governor out there. I don't think, especially now in this stratified culture, I think breaking through on this all for one, one for all effort would be, in my view, a very, kind of a losing battle. And I'll tell you why, and then I'd like to get your feedback on what, this is my reasoning. When we've had collective enemies or adversaries in the past, we could always see them or define them.
Right.
Again, I keep bringing back wars, but those are essentially large national mobilizations. That's what they are. That's what they've been the last century. And when the entire country can see, the threat posed by, say, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, or the pandemic of the flu in the 1919 phase, or polio in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. I could go on and on with various threats that people could pretty much see, day to day. Well, this is this invisible thing. It floats around in the air that no one can, until you get it, or it affects someone you love or care about. It's kind of like not there. And this is why for many months the proponents of essentially freedom, that's what they try to put this under the banner of individual freedom. We're going to get to that later in the show, I hope, talking about weighing freedom, so-called freedom, versus collective responsibilities. That's the discussion we have to have. But that entire crowd was very reluctant to accept that. It's almost like they were completely naive about germ theory. You know what I mean? Like, germ theory wasn't discovered until maybe 150 years ago. Before that, no one knew what germs. What's that? You can't see those. What are those? Same thing. So the enemy that you cannot see, I think, is in many cases more dangerous, more of a threat, because you cannot mobilize and prove it in a sense. Although we certainly know it exists.
I'll take it a step further. Off the top of your head, who's the most famous person you can think of that has died of COVID?
Oh, I guess because I'm political, I would say Herman Cain.
Herman Cain.
Is that it?
Right?
Is that the answer?
I mean, I don't know if there's one answer, but I'm not saying that I wish more people had died.
Right.
But that's part of your problem, is that nobody famous has died from it, right? Then it would be more tangible. It would hit home if somebody, right? When Magic Johnson got AIDS, that's when AIDS hit home, right? And now Herman Cain, and just telling it like it is, Herman Cain was, I believe, 74 years old, and he's African American. And the coronavirus hits older people and minorities harder. So if you are a white Midwesterner, you can still go about your everyday life feeling like this isn't going to affect you. So I think it's what you said is true, and also taken a step further. Not only can you not see the virus, you're not seeing the firsthand effects of it until somebody close to you dies or somebody famous dies. At least if somebody famous had died, that could have reached everyone. So as morbid as that sounds, if a handful of famous people had died, that might have saved thousands of lives. Almost everyone else who has died is relatively anonymous. So that makes it easy also for conspiracy theorists to argue that the numbers are inflated, right? Where it's like, 250,000 people have died. Well, how many of them do you know? Okay, I personally know 3, but if I know 3, that means that there are millions of people that know 0, right? So yeah, it is a messaging issue. I agree with that 100%. Did you want to add anything?
Well, I would say, again, the reluctance of a large segment of the American population to science, to like things like climate change. I mean, before we had COVID, we already had a divide in this country that, I haven't seen, in my lifetime, where there are 2 or 3 or 4 parallel universes of reality. And again, Trump himself coming down with the virus. I mean, can you have imagined in February that when this thing was first broken, he was basically denying that this thing was going to, first of all, hit the United States, then second, that it wasn't that serious, and then third, that it would clear up by Easter, and then I could go on and on and on. Would you have figured that 6 months later, 7 months later, the president himself would come, and his wife, and now his son today, Donald Jr. got it today.
Right.
So would you have ever thought that oh my gosh, it's even penetrating, the highest circles of government. And I would have thought that, I mean, if you would have said in February, hey, if Trump gets it, is that going to be like, is that going to shake up the country? And whoever those deniers were, whoever those people were that were still holdouts and against masks, or again denying the seriousness of coronavirus 19, wouldn't this be the kind of their come to Jesus moment, if I may? And it wasn't. In fact, it seemed to embolden that segment of the populace, because again, Trump trying, a lot of it through, I talked about earlier, marketing, public relations, coming out, driving around, coming back to the White House in a helicopter, standing out on the balcony, and looking, for all intents and purposes, looking very normal, and kind of having this, I'm Superman, and nothing can destroy me. And so the average American, see, look there, look at the president, he survived it, it must not be that dangerous. So even when you talked about earlier that if somebody really famous gets it, you said die from it, you mentioned that's a difference. But even the president himself getting this thing was not enough to shake or move the needle.
But that's the difference, right? I mean, I'm sorry to interrupt. That's the difference. If somebody, not only are they not dying from it, they're at the moment not suffering any effects from it. Now, we don't know what the long-term effects will be. Maybe down the road, people will suffer ill effects from having had it. But right now, you're not. And it's like, not only is everybody famous, and I'm talking athletes, politicians, entertainment people, they're getting it, they're surviving, and they're coming back like nothing happened. So when I say I get it, I mean, I understand the mentality of people who don't want to shut down their lives because they're like, well, look at all these people. They all caught it. Yeah, it's not a picnic, for a few days, but then you're fine and you go back to normal. So why don't we just all do that? Yeah. And it's very easy to say that, again, if you're white, if you're younger, if you have good health care. I mean, right now, people are focused on how the survival rate has improved. And part of that is attributed to, the improved care people are getting in hospitals. What's going to happen when you can't even be admitted to a hospital, right? When it's so full, you can't even get any proper health care. Well, then we're going to see the survival rate take another hit, I think. Sorry, I'm hearing a little feedback, just letting you know.
Yeah.
That just started. Okay. We, again, going back to what I was saying before, we know that COVID disproportionately affects Black communities and elderly communities. And if you have the attitude that you just don't really care that much about them, then your attitude makes sense about mask wearing, right? You think that the people that you might be affecting, the people that could catch it from you, will probably recover. So you don't have that guilt, that feeling of like, oh, I might kill this person, the same way that you would maybe in an inner city or working in a nursing home, or just specific examples. But so again, going back to the original question, like, can we change that mentality? Like, because we're talking about hypotheticals. Let's just, if we could, like, just a discussion about older people, right? Because I think that's without dispute. Like, however you land politically, we can all be in agreement that COVID disproportionately affects older people and is more likely to kill older people.
So far.
Right? Well, disproportionately, I'm saying, right? Like, the death rate might continue climbing, but I think it's always going to affect senior citizens more than anybody else. So that cuts to the core of, like, what are Americans' attitudes towards the elderly? And I don't think that's an easy question, because in the grand scheme of things, the United States generally takes pretty good care of its elderly. compared to other countries, and you might be able to speak to this. I mean, there are plenty of countries around the world that have come to the decision that pouring money into keeping the elderly alive is not the best thing to do with that money. It's not a sustainable thing in the long run, and especially in countries where people retire at a younger age. It's like if you get to age 75 and you get a diagnosis that cancer, whatever, you might have a short time to live.
Yeah.
The United States mentality has usually been throw the kitchen sink at them, try to keep them alive. We're not worried about the cost. Like even if it costs $1 million, let's see if we can keep you alive 2 or 3 more years. And I think the prevailing feeling, in some European countries is, okay, you have a year or 2 left to live. We're just going to try to make that as comfortable for you as possible. And we're not going to throw the kitchen sink at you medically, because that's not efficient from a meta standpoint. So before I go any further, would you agree with that sort of overall picture that the United States tends to take that approach?
Generally, I agree with you in terms of the attitude. I agree that, I guess the term you were talking about here is rationalizing healthcare. In other words, somebody that's
Right.
say 90 that gets cancer is not going to be treated the same way as a 9-year-old that gets cancer. And
Right.
I don't think anybody, well, I guess there's some people out there that will say all lives are equal, but I don't think so. I think you have to make, cost-effective decisions
Right.
about quality of life after treatment. And of course, the 90-year-old, as you mentioned, you talked about MEDA. But I think the one thing you're leaving out a little bit here is the difference in scope on economy. The very wealthy elderly get very good care in this country. If you're poor and old, not so good. So there is clearly we're seeing this with the COVID and the way people are treated. Fortunately, there's been the government response to this, meaning testing is in most cases free for most people, or free in the sense that the government pays for it. We're seeing some mass adjustments towards a collective unity on fighting this threat. That's a very good thing, by the way. That's really an essential fundamental core belief of the left, which is collectively we're stronger than we are individually.
Right.
And so uniting and fighting this through masks, through responsible behavior, through social distancing, these are collective things that will only work to the extent that as many people, like in other words, the more people that follow these things, the better the whole society is, and really the better the individuals within it are. So this is not contrary to individualism. Now, then we're going to get into that debate in just a moment. So, but again, getting back to who gets good health care in this country and doesn't receive as good health care, it's clearly an economic question. And to a large extent, that's been neutralized to some extent through Medicare and Social Security. Fortunately, we have those safety nets.
Right.
Otherwise, this would be an absolute disaster.
Okay, so since you mentioned those, I mean, I feel like when those were enacted, it was like universally accepted that like we're taking
There
care
was
of
great
our
resistance
elderly.
to that, Matt. That's not true. In
Okay.
1936, under FDR, during the New Deal, those were called socialistic programs. Social
Right.
Security and Medicare actually came in 65 under LBJ. Again, LBJ, the socialist, Great Society. There was great resistance among conservatives,
Okay.
supposedly nationalizing retirement plans and health care. There was tremendous resistance to these things. However, working class Americans understood that, what are you going to do? Let grandma, if she gets ick, you're going to let her die in the street? I mean, people understood. It was hitting home, especially in the Great Depression and then up into the 1960s. So fortunately, we have these safety nets. And for the most part, I know we didn't not doing a political show, but it always seems to get political.
That's
But
okay.
fortunately, we have these safety nets, and there are forces in this country on the right who want to scale these protections back. And by the way, if anything COVID has taught us, it's that we cannot fight this thing alone. You cannot fight it through, oh, I have good insurance and I have a good job. Well, that's not the case for a lot of Americans. A lot of Americans are increasingly self-employed. They work out of their homes. They're contractors. They don't have good health insurance through their work. So, that's the way it was, 50, 60 years ago. That's not the way people are today. So again, we increasingly are finding that I think there's a, I think that I think there's some good that'll come out of this, especially once we have a vaccine and hopefully a cure for this thing, or at least a gross reduction in this thing, is that a lot of people will come out and say, as much as the government response, largely in the White House, was a major fuck up, philosophically, it was the right thing again for the government to take control on accelerating a vaccine. We've seen that. That's a must. And then certainly relief for small businesses and individuals through stimulus. That's a plus. It probably saved, a lot of people from eviction and so forth. Eviction, foreclosure. There were some laws that protected people on that. That was a plus. These are all very, very progressive liberal ideas that would never have happened except in a national emergency like COVID. So again, I'm not trying to say let's cheer because we have this awful thing hanging over our heads, but I think there are people that are going to remember these dark days and say, thank goodness there was something there for me through the collectivization of our efforts.
Which makes sense, but then some people, as we know, are going to continue to argue against their best interests, right? I mean, you mentioned Social Security and Medicare, and the right is trying to wipe those out in much the same way that red states seem to shun mask wearing because they really don't seem to have the same concern for the elderly or the people with pre-existing conditions. Like to them, it's just
can I stop you for
survival of the fittest. Yeah.
Sorry, can I stop you for a second?
Yeah.
Only because I don't want the people who are watching us I'm going to challenge you on something. And I'm not necessarily disagreeing with you because I think I know what you're getting at, but I want some clarity on this. Mm-hmm. I don't see, at least where I live, I don't see people resisting wearing masks. In other words, when I talked about Costco earlier, you don't get into Costco unless you have a mask on.
Right.
Or you don't get served in a restaurant, or I should say takeout, what have you, unless you have a mask on. So maybe it's just me or you're observing something I'm not aware of. I don't sense that people are resisting wearing masks. Correct me if I'm wrong on that point, number one. And number two, the resistance that I see to the government mandates or restrictions, particularly on things like, can a bar be open? Can a church be open? Things like that, basically social distancing questions. The objections that I'm seeing from the right or from conservatives are largely based on admittedly some contradictions on enforcement. Like again, I'll use this example in Nevada. How can a casino be allowed to be open in a church? You can't have more than 50 people. That's a fair question. And yes, we'll get to that in a moment, but please draw the distinction here between what you're observing on resistance to masks versus resistance to the government's having authority over individual behavior.
All right, so I'm not talking about specifically my area, right? I mean, where I live, I consider myself lucky that people seem to be pretty good about wearing masks. There's a subculture that I'm hearing about that I'm obviously not participating in, where people are going out at night and going to bars and going to certain places where it's understood that you don't need a mask, because they're just, these particular places don't give a shit. And, I think that's what Gavin Newsom was addressing when he said, well, we're going to restrict, between 10 p.m. and 5 a.m., and some people's reaction was like, well, what the hell good is that going to do? Well, that's what you're stopping. You're stopping these, sort of underground gatherings, in bars where they're like, yeah, come, you don't really need a mask, just come hang out. We all know each other, that sort of.
You look healthy, yeah.
Yeah, you look healthy, right? You're young, you're over 21, but you're under 65. You're good. Come on in. Um, what I've seen from news outlets and interviews and things like that were people, and these are not biased interviews, like these are people that were asked, just about their everyday lives. They're maybe now, right now is different with the current outbreak, but speaking as recently as 2 weeks ago, like people in middle America were not wearing masks. They were going about their lives like COVID did not exist. I'm not saying that in a blanket statement, but there were certainly enough pockets of areas where North Dakota is one example. Nebraska, Iowa. This is why the outbreaks are happening now. I mean, it's not rocket science, right? If people were wearing masks, they wouldn't be in the situation they're in right now. The rally in Sturgis that we know about, 250,000 people and nobody's wearing masks. Um, so, so they're there now. It's going to be a separate question as to whether the events of, you know, the past couple of weeks and the next few weeks, is that going to hit home with people? Who knows? But, I don't want to take it as a given that people are suddenly going to have their eyes opened and change their behavior. So why I was getting into the discussion of the elderly as an example is like, I almost feel like as a country, maybe the trend is that we're starting to abandon the elderly to some extent, and that is inherent in the the mask wearing behavior, where it's like, if you're elderly, if you have a pre-existing condition, go isolate yourself. You're not my problem. Because this every man for himself attitude that's sort of out there now, right? The individualism that you're referring to is like, you worry about yourself. I'm going to go out, I'm going to live my life. And if you don't want to be around me, then stay home. We know it doesn't work that way, but that's the attitude, I think, that needs to be addressed.
Well, I think that you talked about this, the elderly, like, what if this was a disease or something that was impacting teenagers or infants, let's say?
Right.
Would we be taking it, we meaning, the country, would the percentages be higher in terms of not being resistant, say, to government imposed mandates and sanctions and so forth? Again, if babies were dying, let's say there was
Absolutely.
250,000 infants that were dying.
No question, right? I
Excuse
mean,
me?
no
There's no
question.
question. I
Yeah.
agree. However, we've sacrificed the young in great numbers in wars. So let's not pretend. Let's not kid ourselves that who always pays the price when there's a war. And this
Right.
country seems to love a good war seems like all the time.
Mhm.
Certainly doesn't have any problem sacrificing 18 to 25-year-olds in the bloodiest conflicts in history. So so much for the value of human life at any age. I mean, you can make that argument, I guess, is what I'm saying. And I think most people, all of us have parents and grandparents, and I don't know of anybody that's indifferent, say, to their plight or risk or suffering. Even I think if you were to go into the Midwest and some of these communities that are resistant to um, masks and again some of the closures, this is purely anecdotal,
Mhm.
but based on my conversations and interactions and a lot of online discussions with people in these parts of the country, uh, again, maybe I'm interpreting this wrongly, but they are well aware that their 79-year-old father, grandfather, whatever, may have to, well, definitely has to adhere to different guidelines than, say, the 20-year-old, which is why you see in Florida, when this first broke out, spring break in Daytona Beach was just as wild and
Right.
crazy. And everybody went ape shit when they started trying to close the beaches down there. And, this and that, and you see parties and you see political rallies. And, in fairness, to keep this equal, when there were a lot of demonstrations and protests going on in this country during the summer, a lot of the people that were protesting were certainly not social distancing. So I think that we have to accept some responsibility for that as well. But again, those were largely young people on the beaches at the protests and so forth. And I think you'd be the first to agree, although we're not young men anymore, there is something that when you're 18 to say 25, you do feel I think it's just in the DNA to feel, you know, kind of like you've got the world and you are
Yeah.
kind of indestructible. I know that's a little bit of an exaggeration, but that's, you know, the testosterone and the way that we're built. And then as you get older and more vulnerable and realize you can't run as fast or do what have you, then you start recognizing your limitations. But when you're 20, you don't feel that way. So I think that the behavior we're seeing on those beaches, and even that even extends today into the Midwest, a lot of isolated communities, guys on motorcycles. We're talking about the Sturgis thing in South Dakota, that happened, I think, back in July, where now we're seeing the ramifications of that. Again, these are bikers, man. You know, these are people that, you know, they're badasses. And I can understand how that fits. Uh,
Right.
and that's really it gets into really, that is kind of an American thing. Uh, if you go to, say, other cultures, particularly in Asia, certainly in Latin America and in Europe, there is much more of a sense of conformity, that when the government or the leader or the institutions of leadership in a society tell you, hey, we're going to stay at home. Uh, you know, there are no protests in Italy for the most part, right?
Right.
We saw northern Italy particularly devastated. Spain had this problem. Other parts of Europe as well. But there were no protests in Italy. But again, these cultures they're used to living closer together. They're used to government being involved in their lives. So, and there's also a greater sense of respect and trust in authorities. Certainly in medical professionals and in science, I would say
Mm.
the level of respect and trust and following what they say is much higher in other societies than the United States. But the United States, I think, for all of the great things that rugged individualism produce in this country, through inventions, through in, innovations and this and that, one of the drawbacks to that is the resistance to um, essentially go along with the crowd or going along with rules. We're kind of a nation of outlaws. Even going back to the
Right.
West, who were the people that had the great Western expansion? They were outlaws. They were risk takers. They were people that didn't want to listen to government. And so we are the descendants. We live in the West. We're kind of the descendants of those people. And there's probably something a little different in the DNA of the immigrants who came to this country and took great risks and tried to flee those societies than, say, the people who stayed back in them and still have some what I call old fashioned values about how individuals should behave vis-a-vis the government.
That's a great point. That and that fits a lot of what we're saying. I mean, I've had the thought that, like, take a politician, say somebody that doesn't exist to this point. They just do everything right to protect their people. They do every single thing they're supposed to do.
Right.
They're still going to have a significant part of their constituency against them, right? And it's what you're speaking to. That it's like, it's not that the politician, that specific politician, is doing anything wrong. It's just that there's this resistance to authority in general, which is going to make this situation even tougher. Um, I'll tell you a thought I had, and I can guess what your answer will be. But so again, every time I'm going to speak again with my examples. Cuomo and Newsom, are the two I'm most familiar with. Um, they have largely done a good job of communicating. For a long time, they would hold like daily news conferences, whatever. They had their detractors, and they didn't do everything perfect, but they would, communicate well. And even so, you go online, and the majority of the comments are hateful. Like hateful. I'm not saying like I respectfully disagree with what you say, Mr. Governor. It's more like, get the fuck out of my state type of shit.
I'm
I
seeing that online, by the way, all the time right now, especially real quick. You live in California. I
Yeah,
think Newsom has now um, is it a curfew? Is that what I saw?
yeah, yeah,
And
from
there's
10
just
to 5.
everybody's going crazy. By the way, I want you to
Yeah,
address something in your answer. I'm sorry to interrupt, but I'm really curious about this
sure.
because you're the first person I've talked to since the curfew, I think, was announced. I'd like you to put in your comments or answer, you've got to sympathize with small business people, restaurant owners, and people that, are probably living on the edge right now and are, a week away from closing the doors. There's thousands of people in this situation. And well, what do you say to them? I mean, what do we say to them? I think that we can win on the science argument, but what do you say to somebody who's getting ready to board up their windows? I got to admit, that's a tough one.
But in reference to the curfew, I mean, the curfew is from 10 p.m. to 5 a.m. So like I said before, who's that going to affect? That's going to affect maybe bars, card rooms. Certain card rooms are closing their graveyard hours. I'm sorry, but I do sympathize with small business owners. But as far as bars are concerned, that makes perfect sense to me, because the whole idea is that you loosen your inhibitions when you're drinking. And if you're drinking in groups in a bar with no masks, that is the perfect situation for the virus to spread. So the fact that he pinpointed that one specific thing to deal with, I'm totally fine with that. If he said everybody's got to stay at home 24 hours, yeah, that's a different story. But we're talking about graveyard hours. What does that really affect other than bars and maybe late night eateries? I mean, In-N-Out Burger will have to close 2 hours early or whatever. Okay, they're still going to get the majority of their business, before 10 o'clock. So I mean, that's my response to that. You said you've seen the comments online. We've talked, our first episode was about all the misinformation online. I want to take a step back because I don't want to sound like too conspiracy theorist or whatever, but who benefits from the United States having a COVID outbreak? Our foreign adversaries, right? If anybody, right? I mean, maybe certain tech company, like, if we're getting real technical, like a company like Zoom might benefit from us staying at home longer because their stock will continue to go through the roof. But I mean,
Amazon.
for the most part, Amazon, certain tech companies, but in a larger sense, when the United States is weakened, our foreign adversaries benefit. And COVID is weakening us at a disproportionate rate.
I don't agree with that.
Go ahead.
I just have to interrupt you because they're going through the same challenges, problems as the United States. You've seen the numbers out of Russia this week. And those are definitely underreported. So I mean, obviously, maybe it's certainly hitting the United States worse than other countries, but I don't think that anybody anywhere would say this is helping us. Maybe you could clarify.
I would clarify that if it hits the United States worse than it hits other countries, like obviously no place is immune unless you're in New Zealand or whatever. But I'm saying, like, if the United States is going to be weakened disproportionately to other countries, that was all I was saying with that.
Yeah.
Basically, and my general question was like, all these people that are coming out online and speaking out against authority figures, I always had the impression that maybe a lot of them are bots or trolls or whatever, but you made the case that this is an American mindset, that these probably are legitimate American accounts and just people that are resisting authority just for the purpose of resisting authority.
I mean, these are people that want to go to the football game and they don't understand why they can't watch, whoever their football team is, or, and they can enjoy their season tickets, or can't go out and bowl with their buddies, or, play poker at the casino. Hey, who's not frustrated about some of these things? I don't think there's any question that those are, inconveniences. But again, we're a very spoiled culture. We've had it really good in this country for a long time, man. And, we've got this whole thing of like this almost just, we have a sense of entitlement. Like this is the way it's always going to be. And that's not the case. And we've been very lucky. I think I've seen from medical professionals, I've read some on this, that there should be a pandemic like this about once every 30 or 40 years. We actually avoided it. We had SARS and we had, some of the other things, but anything of this magnitude, we've been very, very lucky. It's kind of like the asteroid. It's supposed to hit once every 180,000 years or something. We're way overdue at that
Right.
one too. So when the asteroid comes,
So it's great.
we are fucked.
The second we get a vaccine, here comes the asteroid. Crap.
Comes the asteroid. Oh shit! We needed a comic moment.
God damn it.
Got it.
Yeah.
Where were we?
Well,
Well,
know.
listen. Talk about.
Well,
I want you to talk about that. And I just hate this argument, but I unfortunately we're confronted with it, and the people that believe it, they're entitled to an explanation and answer and the other side of this. By the way, I'll get to this toward the end of the show about why I've kind of given up on this. But since we're talking about it, I'd like to. You seem to
Okay.
still have a sword out there, and you're ready to continue fighting. I think I've given up on this, but talking about people that talk about the freedom thing and my individual freedom. I have the right to go around and do this and that, and I think that one thing, like there was an argument on the churches, like churches being closed or shuttered. And this is by state, it's different. Some states allow, I think, up to 50 people. Others said no church at all, and it's all over the map on this. Hey, we're 50 different states, 50 different laws. That's a set of laws. Right. That's the way it is. That's the system we have, whether it's good or bad. But I do believe that those people, again, who are upset that they can't go to church or can't go bowling, they are entitled to an explanation because they think that, especially if they're in some small town, they see no cases of COVID. They're wondering how come they have to go through the same restrictions as, in a sense, it's not really quite true, but suffer some of the same inconveniences of someone in New York City. That's a fair question. What would you say to them?
Well, I mean, like you said, the laws are different between states. So, I mean, if you are in the Midwest, I don't think your laws are going to be the same as New York City, for example. I think it comes back to mask wearing. I mean, I think people are afraid, or politicians are afraid of the backlash if they try to enforce mask wearing. I mean, it's not even, it's more about the optics of it, right? Because it's not strictly enforceable. Like you use Costco as an example. What you can enforce is people wearing a mask when they walk through the door or when they check out. Between those two times, you're pretty much working on either the honor system or you're hoping that, customers will police themselves, right? I mean, you just can't have employees following everybody around to make sure they're wearing masks. And that's even more so when you take it to a citywide level or a statewide level. Like if you have a mask mandate, it's mostly symbolic, right? I mean, again, when you walk through the door of a business, you should have it on. You should have it on while you're doing business, in an enclosed space. And then when you're on your own, do whatever you want. It's not that hard, right? It's not rocket science. And yet a lot of politicians are resistant to even make that mostly symbolic mandate because they're worried about backlash. And, that comes back to the mentality of their constituents where, personal freedoms, like when did this ever become a personal freedom issue? Can I take a step back for 1 second and say like another thing that I think is at play in terms of the mask wearing, right? Trump did a lot of shitty things. I'm not rehashing all of them. We could spend days on that. One of the shittiest things he did, and I touched on this in one of our previous episodes, is that he tries to discredit the people that are coming forward to being honest and are actually have the public's good in mind, like Dr. Fauci and Dr. Birx. He tries to portray their advice as not being trustworthy, which is even more infuriating because it's thanks to doctors like them that he even learned about coronavirus in the first place before the general public did. And he knew that it was an airborne disease and he knew everything. He was well equipped to deal with it on a national level. He just decided to completely misuse the information he was given. And that's when mask wearing became politicized. Um, as I referred to previously, like he tried to portray Dr. Fauci as having flip-flopped on the idea of mask wearing, which is just patently untrue. They just didn't want us hoarding masks when they were needed for frontline workers. So the early advice was stay home, isolate, flatten the curve, let the masks get to the people who need them the most. And then, once they've got them, then yes, everybody should go out and wear a mask. And one of the shittiest things Trump did was to portray doctors as having flip-flopped on the issue and cast doubt into his followers' minds that maybe you don't need to wear a mask because originally the doctors didn't think you needed to, which is false. So that brings us to where we are today, where, with people disregarding the advice of the doctors and not wearing masks in certain areas of the country, we are seeing firsthand how bad it could have been at the beginning throughout the country. If nobody had worn a mask, we're seeing, what, 30% positivity rates in certain states right now? So when people are like, why can't I go to a church, or why can't I do, because we're seeing right now why you couldn't. This is the result. Like at the time when the rates were low, I understand the frustration, but it was for your own good. And now people that have decided to flaunt that advice have not only damaged themselves, they've damaged their communities. And if you really are concerned about your neighbors and you're a church-going person and love thy neighbor, you're not just wearing a mask for yourself, you're wearing it to protect your neighbor. So that would be my argument to them. And if everybody was on board with wearing masks, then there probably wouldn't need to be restrictions on churches. As long as you sat 6 feet apart. I mean, you made a very good point about the casinos and the churches. That's totally valid. Like, if you can go to a casino, you should be able to go to a church. You should just have to follow the same regulations as when you enter a casino. Wear a mask, distance, wash off the things that you touch. Okay. And even doing all those things, people are still falling sick at casinos. So as long as you understand the risk and you're willing to go to a church under those circumstances, yeah, I mean, I get that. But
Now, I think one of the things that greatly bothers me, and this is not just a problem related to COVID, it's just a problem that's with us, and it seems to be getting worse. And that's that this idea about American superiority or American exceptionalism, I think, has cost us, especially on this one. There's a lot we can learn from other cultures, and we seem to be, especially this current administration, seems to be reluctant to learn from, again, other nations and governments. We can point to success stories. Taiwan is probably the best example. South Korea as well. I could list some others. But these are cases of the nations that were much closer to the outbreak, the initial origin of the outbreak. And they have certainly more travel to and from those places. And yet their rates of infection and death were substantially lower. I mean, almost, it's amazing what Taiwan did. Now, Taiwan's an island. There are advantages that Taiwan has, that South Korea has, and other places too. So let's be clear about that. There's no way the United States could match those very low numbers. However, I don't know why we're so reluctant to look across at other, again, cultures and say, hey, what did they do right that maybe we could copy and learn from? And except for academics, and occasionally you'll see something in the New England Journal of Medicine or in Harper's or the Atlantic, or you'll see it in a magazine that's read by 300,000 people, where the average person's not going to see this, and so there's just no sense of curiosity or desire to look at success stories and say, how can we again learn from them? I find this stubbornness just appalling. And here we are. I don't know how many lives we could have saved by saying, "Hey, look what they did. Let's copy that. That seems to be working. And if it doesn't work, we can change it. We can do something else. But let's give this a shot." And of course, this particular administration and conservative, supposedly nationalistic, pro-American politicians are going to be very reluctant to learn from, oh my gosh, a foreign country. Are you kidding me? So this is really poisoned, I think, our perceptions. And why now is the United States, and we have no reason to be number one in the rate of infections per capita and in deaths. There's no reason for this. We are isolated to some extent by oceans. We have a lot of travel. Yes, that is true. But so again do other nations surrounding China. Certainly Europe. People much closer together there. And the rates of infection and death are high in some nations there too. It's very clear. But the United States should have done a much better job. That's very clear. And I think a lot of that was just our reluctance and our stubbornness and our nationalism, being reluctant to, again, learn from the successes of other nations.
How much do you feel like misinformation played into that? I mean, not just that we weren't willing to learn, but that we were actively being fed bad information.
Well, a lot of this, of course, stems from the politicization of the virus itself, and the Trump administration insisting that it be called the China virus,
Right.
the Wuhan virus. I mean, there was clearly uh, there was an attempt to attribute guilt, responsibility to the place that it broke out. And by the way, we could have this, what I call this post mortem. We could have this later. Maybe China didn't do a lot of things right, and they should have some fingers pointed at them. I'm the first to say that. I'm the first to admit that. In fact, I'm going to be real curious as to what historians and documentaries are going to say about this virus in 5 or 10 years. I don't think it's going to paint our culture, our leadership particularly favorably at all. I think it's going to be even more of an indictment than it currently is. Once some of the things behind the scenes, our withdrawal from, say, the funding of the World Health Organization, our resistance to so-called globalization. By the way, globalization is this dirty word now with about 40% of the population. Unfortunately, whether we like it or not, a pandemic is a global problem that does not respect borders nor have any sense of national identity. Therefore, your American flag is not going to protect you, ladies and gentlemen. So this is the thing why we are so interconnected now, just not just economically or militarily or in terms of national security, but especially true on things like energy, and certainly on medicine and medical emergencies. By the way, real quick on this to me, if there was any example of something that worked, when I talk about globalism or a global response working together, it was the outbreak in Africa about
Mhm.
4 or 5 years ago, if you recall, when
Yeah.
I don't remember the numbers, but there were about 100,000 people that died. And you remember that some of the planes started landing in the United States, and they were carrying this. Do you recall this was about 5 years ago, and people were afraid. There were people in Congress saying ban all the flights from Africa and shut it down and this and that. Well, that was during the Obama administration. I don't mean to make that a political thing, but this was an administration that clearly understands the inherent responsibilities of a superpower like the United States to work with all nations, and particularly go to places that maybe it's not really in our uh, direct or foreseeable interest to go to wherever. I forgot where the origin of this was. Maybe it was in the Congo. I forgot where it was, but to go down to the Congo and spend uh, uh, $40 million fighting this with medical professionals. Now, fortunately, the United States and the medical community, the global medical community, went down there, and they pretty much eradicated this thing. And this could have been much, much worse. So again, we have an example from history of something that worked, where the medical establishment. I'm certainly not an expert on this, but all of my information is secondhand. I'm not a science person, but certainly we know how when governments work together and take this, on, collectively speaking, with all the medical professionals, with no boundaries, with no sense of, it's got to be an American solution. How about how we have a global solution on this? And that worked again in Africa 5 years ago. And then what have we done this time? We did just the opposite. And now the response has hit home, the United States, the very worst. And it's directly attributable to the flawed thinking on this topic.
It's hard to prove a negative, right? When you have Ebola and SARS, and when we think about how bad that could have been if it had hit the United States, but because it never happened, like, we'll never know just how good of a job, or the public will never know just how good of a job was
Excuse me,
done on
Matt.
that.
Also, let me point out one more thing. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I
Sure.
just have to point this out, that you talk about scary. Do you remember the Ebola? And do you remember the medical professionals having to wear the hazmat suits?
Yeah.
Right now, you have the shield and you have the gloves and all that. And I'm not saying that's comfortable. It's not. But they were a lot of those medical professionals were in Africa. 90% humidity, insects, 100 degrees. It was not comfortable wearing those. You talk about some heroes, and they went down there, the medical establishment, Doctors Without Borders, a lot of things like that. And even the United States military was lended a lot of assistance. So I want to make it real clear that was, you talk about scary, that was really scary for the medical professionals. You talk about heroes. I mean, risking your life to go down and fight and to fly to the Congo or places, and talk about risking your life for complete strangers, not even, Americans or your neighbors or what have you. To me, that's like, I'm not spiritual, but man, to me, that's like, that's something,
And that goes back to an earlier point. Like, can't we universally agree that our healthcare professionals are like our heroes these days? I mean,
Yeah.
that shouldn't be controversial, right?
Right.
I mean, I don't know. You seem to be at even more of a loss than I am about what it might take to change people's behavior.
Well, let me run this by you, Matt.
Sure.
I guess we're going to get ready to close the show, but I think we have to tackle one. It's the white elephant in the room. Medical people, I understand, have the Hippocratic oath. In other words, do no harm, and then you try to treat people, and you do not ask how. A medical professional. I don't know again what training they receive, but apparently it's astonishing how unprejudiced or unbiased they are when they're treating people. It doesn't matter if the person is a homeless person or a millionaire laying on the stretcher. They receive, at least to some extent, they receive the same care. Meaning, like if they're dying, you immediately try to do what you can for them. I think most people would generally agree with that. But I wonder, though, in the case of people who have just absolutely denied, if we get to the point where people are, again, waiting in emergency rooms and can't find a bed, and then there's no ventilators, or this thing gets really out of hand this winter, and there was some way to identify those who just completely were oblivious to the rules and the mandates and were reckless, I wonder, obviously it's not going to happen because it's not the way our culture is. But should that question be brought up or answered, and if so, how would you answer it?
I mean, I think I see where you're going with that. I mean, that's what ends up being the arguments on social media, where it's like, oh, you think it's fake, then okay, then you don't go to a hospital when you get sick.
Right.
But of course, they're still gonna go to a hospital when they get sick, and they're still gonna get care.
Right.
And you're gonna have like a Chris Christie situation, right? Where it's like after he gets sick and after he gets taken care of, then maybe people come clean and they're like, oh, I totally underestimated this. You should listen to me now. This is serious, but where were you when we needed you? And that's a good case scenario, right? There's how many other people are getting sick and recovering, and they're just like, this is nothing. Don't worry about it. They're not helping the matter any. So I think what you were describing is more wishful thinking than anything else, right? I mean, everybody's going to get the same care, that they can handle.
Well, what I'm getting at is this: is that, and I'm not proud of this moment. I'm not proud of the stage of. I guess just complete disconnect that I've reached, because I've always been a person that was very involved, in politics and in social affairs, and I do, obviously I care about people. I wouldn't be involved in these larger questions unless I had some sense of responsibility and caring about others. But at some point you reach just your point of defeat, and I think I've reached it, probably a lot of it because of the election that we just went through. I've reached the point of just, we tried. You tried to show evidence. You tried to show data. You have people dying, huge numbers. The president himself gets it. I mean, and people are still in denial about how serious it is, and are still acting irresponsibly. At some point, you just throw your hands up. At least I have, and said, "Fuck it." That is not, by the way, a cavalier attitude. I've before I said the word "fuck it," I thought, "Do I really want to say this?" And for a while, I resisted. No, no, let's, give people a chance. They'll see the light. Provide enough evidence, maybe some firsthand experiences, as you mentioned earlier. If you had a friend or a family member that went through it, but now we have people themselves even getting stricken with this thing that are still in denial, and you just say, well, okay, I got more important things to worry about. So I'll get into this now with you. You mentioned earlier at the show about public relations campaigns and trying to get people to wise up on this matter. And I said that it was all for naught. We've kind of like, that ship sailed. If they haven't come to some sense of awareness about how dangerous this thing is by now, I mean, what will it take? I guess, people like laying in the streets piled up like, I don't want to get into old imagery, but it's, things that are just truly frightening. I guess maybe, but I mean, is that what it's going to take? So I don't know. It's just these combination of factors, this echo chamber of disinformation that you mentioned earlier. It's also just a sense of, I think, selfishness. We're all a little bit this way, by the way. And when it's not like we're all perfect here, but we do tend to take care of ourselves first, and we want to please ourselves first, and your neighbor, well, if we can get to that, okay, maybe I'll do that. But I do think that that's inherent really in all Americans, or in this culture. It's been ingrained in us, and that's hard to get people to change. And in some people, particularly in the red states like you were talking about, the middle of the country, clearly this is ingrained, where it's absolutely almost a religion, where I'm not going to have the government tell me when I can go out and shop. I'm not going to listen to that. And so I don't know how you change those people, and you get the last word here, I guess. I have given up the effort to try to change them. Am I wrong?
Are you wrong to give up? It's a personal decision, I suppose. I mean, when I talk about giving up, it's not like I personally can
No,
have much effect on anything.
To argue with these people, I guess is
I
what.
see.
Excuse me.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
I'm not. I'm not
Yeah.
digging my grave here.
Okay. I mean, I don't know what you meant exactly, but I don't know, right? Because arguing gets you nowhere. So I sort of agree with the idea of stop arguing, but then that was sort of, the origin of this discussion is like, well, what can you do instead? Like, or does it just have to be experiential wisdom? Does it just have to be, somebody has to lose somebody close to them, you know, or even not necessarily that, but just the virus starts hitting home in your community, which I think now, the number of places in the United States that can say that they're removed from the virus is less and less. I mean, West Virginia just got hit, the Midwest states, Montana. What's going to happen when, you're sick and you're like, all right, I'm sick, I'm just going to go to the hospital. Oh, no, there's no room for you. Like, that should be a wake-up call. And even if that doesn't happen to you, if that happens to somebody or something, but, so it probably takes getting millions, tens of millions of people infected for everybody to reach that same result. I mean, I guess the only, I don't even know if I'd call it an argument, but just to point out something that I see tossed around, especially early on, right? People were tossing around the idea of herd immunity. And
Yeah.
it's like, I feel like they completely misunderstood that concept. And I'm not blaming them. I just think people had in their mind that the idea of herd immunity is that everybody gets it and then everybody's immune, which is almost never how it works. Like, first of all, herd immunity almost always involves a vaccine because vaccines are not 100% effective for the most part. So people that were talking about herd immunity without a vaccine, I feel like they're just not getting it. But then, if I could just take a minute to break it down a little further, I mean, let's say everybody got infected, literally everybody in the United States. Even if we give it a fatality rate of only 1%, you're talking like 3.2 million people are going to die. Then the actual fatality rate is almost definitely going to be higher than that because so many people are not going to have access to life-saving healthcare, right? Everybody is going to be left to fend for themselves for the most part if everybody was infected. On top of that, the immunity we're talking about is not lifelong immunity. Like, there is no proof that you get COVID once and you're immune for the rest of your life. There are clear cases of people catching it a second time. The prevailing wisdom in the scientific community is that immunity might last for a year. And you might need to get a vaccine every year, just like you get a flu shot every year. So this whole idea of herd immunity, like, give everybody the coronavirus, kill off 3 million people, and then you might have to go through the same thing next year. Makes absolutely no sense. And then finally, like we said earlier, we don't know the long-term health implications of catching the virus. Whatever they are, you're almost certainly going to be better off having never caught the virus than if you did and survived. So I just want to, if there's two myths I want to dispel, it's that health experts flip-flopped on wearing masks is not true, and that herd immunity is a possibility without a vaccine. That's not true either. So if we can, even accept just those two starting points and then maybe come closer to some sort of agreement on the best way forward. But having said that, I fully understand your fuck it mentality in terms of arguing with people. Maybe everybody just has to learn on their own. Maybe they just need, some experience to happen to them, and hopefully it's not a death to themselves or their family. But
And I'll say one
yeah,
last thing, Matt, if I may.
of course.
We're a good hour or so into the show, and when you proposed this idea to me to do a intelligent discussion on COVID, I was initially reluctant to do so, and the reason why is I'm very upfront about this. I have no medical knowledge, training, never taken a class in anything. I failed college biology. True, I really did. So only F I ever got was I failed it. I mean, I know
Right.
I'm really, really poor in this area. Now, it doesn't mean that I'm not curious about it, and it certainly doesn't mean that I don't understand the importance of science and revere those who are involved in the pursuit of knowledge and who make all of our lives inherently better, not just through technology, but through medicine and the treatment of things like viruses and pandemics like this one. So what I've the reason that I said let's do this show was I wanted to make it very clear that there's a lot of Nolan Dallas out there, meaning
Mhm.
you don't have the knowledge, experience, training to really have an opinion on um, what the proper response is medically speaking or scientifically. Now, I have my opinions, of course, uh, government because I used to work in government and I have a fair knowledge about how social sciences and organizers and things like that could best address this. That's some of the I guess that's in my wheelhouse of skills if I have any. And you have similar ones as well as a communicator, Matt. But you're also not a medical professional, so both of us then have to defer to those who know a lot more than we do, and let's listen to them. And I'll say this, that from the very first moment that we heard the word COVID, which I think for me was maybe in January, it's the first time I ever heard the word. Maybe it was earlier, I don't know. The White House response and the national response from a government or management point of view, a crisis management point of view, should have been the president or Pence, Vice President Pence, coming up to the microphone with daily press conferences, information provided. By the way, you remember the whole country stopped for those press conferences when they first started because this was a national emergency. And of course, it turned into a political theater and circus and a joke. But the response should have been the president or the vice president or whoever's heading up the coronavirus task force to step up to the microphone and said, my name is Vice President Mike Pence, and here's what we've done this week. Now let me refer you to Dr. Birx, Dr. Fauci, other medical professionals. They will take your questions now.
Right.
They will take your questions now. And they'll sit here and answer them as long as it takes for the American people to hopefully be informed. That was just the opposite of what happened. I mean, they were used as props. And that's just a disgrace to me. And so from a information management standpoint, the ball was dropped from day one. And here we are, 8 months later, entering what some are calling a dark winter is on the horizon. And it's not getting better. So again, we're paying the price now for the mistakes made in early 2020.
And we need to, I mean, not only do we need to listen to the healthcare professionals, can we start out by universally respecting them? I mean, how ridiculous is it that they're receiving death threats? I mean, I understand those are just some crazy fringe people, but everybody should be speaking out against that. I mean, these people, if you enter the healthcare field, whatever your motivation, you're there to help other people, you know, and these people are, you know, putting their reputations out there. Like I said, doctors and nurses. I mean, I can't think of anybody else that deserves our respect more.
Right. Matt, let me throw in one more thing
Sure.
about that. These are not isolated cases. We've seen these on signs all over the place. Signs meaning when a lot of people are out there protesting against these restrictions at state capitals and in Washington. You know, this is not just a few crackpots, okay? It's a much larger number. Number two, real quick on Fauci. This has never been mentioned by anyone anywhere, and I don't know why it's not. I guess because Fauci's too much of a public servant and a gentleman not to bring this up. But I don't know what Fauci's salary is. I'm guessing he's probably a GS, maybe 18 or 19. That's a good government job, but it pays, don't quote me on this. It pays 180, 190. It pays probably close to 200,000 a year. Again, don't quote me, but which sounds like a pretty good salary. Do you know how much Fauci could make on the board of a pharmaceutical company or an HMO if he wanted to? He's 79 years old. If he wanted to sell out, and he could make before coronavirus, before he was a household name, he could have sat on these boards and made so much goddamn money as one of these paid whores, like a lot of medical professionals do, who completely sell out and go along with whatever the company's doing. And Fauci didn't do that. He stayed in government, worked for administrations on both sides of the aisle, was always apolitical, meaning he never got, even when he's attacked now, he doesn't get political on any of his stuff. And how about if there's anybody who's not corruptible, it's Fauci.
Right.
Because he could have made a fortune by doing what a lot of other medical professionals do, and that's selling out to the medical establishment.
That's a fantastic point. Let's respect him. Let's respect everyone. Basic respect. That's not too much to ask. We can drink to that. Nolan, thanks so much. I know you weren't crazy about this topic, but it just felt very timely. It felt like something we really had to do. And I appreciate your input. You made a lot of great points. And
you did too.
Thank you to anyone who was listening. And, I'm Matt Lessinger with Nolan, Dalla, and we'll talk with you again next week. Take care.